Welcome to Thoughtfully Mindless. My guest in this episode is Dr. Sarah Wayland. Dr. Wayland is a parent coach, RDI Consultant, and Neurodivergent Resource Navigator. She holds a PhD in cognitive psychology and has held positions at Northeastern University, University of Maryland School of Medicine, and University of Maryland Center for Advanced Study of Language. Dr. Wayland is passionate about supporting neurodivergent individuals, both professionally and as a parent. She's the founder and owner of Guiding Exceptional Parents and hosts several online training programs with her friend Penny Williams at their online resource, The Behavior Revolution. She is the co-author of the book, Is This Autism? A Guide for Clinicians and Everyone Else, which was recently released in June. We discuss a wide range of topics, including her coaching profession, ADHD, autism, the education system, and much more. I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. And with that, let's welcome Dr. Wayland. Dr. Wayland, thank you so much for joining me today.
I am so pleased to be here. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, so we're going to talk about neurodiverse people. And before we started when we set up this interview, you said, let's just go with it and see where it goes. And I
Yeah.
appreciate that because in my previous interviews, I planned the interview a lot, and I actually want to get away from that a bit. So I like the spontaneity.
Okay.
Although I do, there's a little anxiety about it because it's a little harder to go unplanned, but I'm excited for it. So
Yeah.
to start off, I was wondering if we can just go into what neurodivergent means, because I've really only started hearing about that word specifically over the last few years. So
Yeah.
how long has it been around and what does it mean exactly?
Oh, that's a great question. So the idea of neurodiversity, I think, sort of made its way into, I don't know, the discussion in the 90s. I think it's Judy Singer. In her dissertation, I'm very bad with dates, so I may be getting that date wrong. But anyway, in her dissertation, she talked about neurodiversity. And the idea behind neurodiversity is that we all have different wiring, right? All our brains are different. Like no two brains are going to be the same. And I'm just remembering this really great episode of a podcast I love called 99% Invisible. And they were talking about the average person. So when they first started designing airplanes for pilots, they were designing the cockpit for the average pilot. And so they measured all these people and came up with this average pilot. And then they designed it. And it turns out that it didn't fit anybody, because there is actually no one who is the average person. And so what they realized is they had to make it customizable. So you could lift the seat up or you could move the wheel and so on.
Yeah.
Brains are the same. None of them are the same. Each of them is wired up in different ways. There are certain overarching principles like, we all see if we have the apparatus to be able to see. And so most people's, occipital cortexes are, going to be wired to allow you to be able to process visual information. But what you see and what I see, like how our brains process that information and take it in, I'm becoming more and more convinced that we see it all in different ways. And so I'll just use as an example my husband and me, who I know see things differently. So there are like male-female differences in the number of colors that people can distinguish, for example. So that's a pretty well-known one. But something I really think is he has what I call the find it gene, where he can just look in a room and I'm like, I cannot find this pencil to save my life. And it's right there for him. And I look at it and I think, how did I not see that? Like it really wasn't, I couldn't see it. And for him, it was just immediately obvious, right? And so his brain is wired differently somehow to pick that pencil out than mine is. And so what we see, and that's just one of the bazillion domains that we have, where we can take information from the world and translate it into information that our brains can use in very different ways. And the idea of neurodiversity is that there's a range. So people talk about, most people sort of fall in the middle of the range of, I don't know what wavelengths we would call red, for example. But other people may fall, on the outside. Maybe, they don't perceive that wavelength, but they perceive other wavelengths. I don't know. I'm just making stuff up here.
Okay.
But the idea being that many people see things in a particular way, but there are always going to be people who process that information a little differently and see the world a little differently. And so that's across every domain: hearing, anything involving the senses, right, that come in. And so this idea that there's normal, right? So one of the things that I don't believe there is normal. I actually don't. And one of the I don't know, one of the things about individual differences that I think is so important is to just remember we each have different ways of interfacing with the world, and our bodies have different responses. So neurodiversity basically just says that we all have our own makeup, and there's some stuff that you can sort of rely on, like, you learn that a particular sensation is red, and I've learned that whatever my version of that sensation is called red. Right? But who knows what each of us is actually perceiving on that. And it may have an impact on how we process a stop sign or, something else that's red. So but the idea is that everybody is a little bit different, and some of us are more different than others.
Okay. Yeah, I remember when I was 17 or 18, I was having a conversation with a friend of mine, and I was asking him about kind of the same thing. I was
Mm,
like, okay, so we've both been taught that grass is green, but how do we know we're seeing the same color? Like, how do we
yes,
know
exactly.
that what you're seeing is the same thing as I'm seeing? Like,
Yeah,
we could just be labeling different colors the same thing because that's what we've been trained to do through schooling and stuff like that.
exactly.
Yeah, it's very interesting because when I've gone to the doctor or different things when I was younger, the way I always looked at it is I don't know what's normal. I only know what I've
Yep,
experienced. Like I don't
of
know
course.
what goes on in other people's bodies and what goes on in
Mm-hmm.
their heads. So
Yep.
with neurodiversity, it seems to be usually talked about with regard to ADHD and autism and
Mm-hmm.
other potential learning disabilities.
Right.
Is it specific to that? It sounds like everyone is neurodiverse in some way.
Or
Um,
neurodivergent
neurodivergent,
is
yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
It's such a great question. That's such a great question. And I would argue that all of us are a little bit different from each other,
Yeah.
right? Just how my brain wired up when I was a little baby and my parents were teaching me what green was and what grass was, right? Like what I was exposed to. I was in Tucson, Arizona at the time, and maybe what grass looked like to me back then, conditions what I think grass looks like now. But you are correct that mostly people use it to apply to neurodevelopmental differences like dyslexia, autism, ADHD, things like that. I actually think we could make it a much bigger designation of differences, and I actually think that would be helpful.
Okay. So you help people as a coach, but you also
Mhm.
have a PhD in cognitive psychology and psycholinguistics. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
So I've been talking to a few coaches in different realms lately, and my girlfriend and I have both kind of been wondering, like, what exactly is a coach, and like, where does a coach step in? Where does a psychiatrist or a psychologist step in?
Mm.
Can you dive into that a little bit and kind of explain, I guess, your journey to where you're at and why you work as a coach with a PhD?
Okay, it's such a great question, and so many people are confused by that. So let me start with psychiatry versus psychology. Psychiatrists are medical doctors. They're trained in medical school. They can prescribe medication, and their training is really about diagnosing, problems, but also helping people with wellness or whatever. But their training is very much in the medical model of how people are. Um, and the biggest difference, I think, is they can prescribe medication. So if you have ADHD, you might have been diagnosed by a psychologist, but then you would go to a psychiatrist or another medical doctor to prescribe medication for you if that's something you would need to help manage your ADHD. So some psychiatrists do provide therapy. Some do not. Most do not. But some definitely do. So they're trained also in how to help people navigate the world more effectively, right? So psychologists are trained in programs like there are two kinds of psychologists. There's PhDs and what are called PsyDs, and they're both trained in how the human mind works. And
Yeah.
PhD psychologists have to do a research project that is contributes uniquely to the field, and you have to do a PhD thesis, and hopefully publish your results and all that. PsyDs also have to do a research project, but the emphasis of that degree is more on learning to be a good clinician. So very much on you get clinical training, you have supervised hours, and a clinical psychologist also has that training, right? So they meet with clients, and somebody is supervising their work and making sure they're doing a good job while they're learning. I think they have to have something like it depends on the state how many hours you have to be licensed. But the other part of this is being licensed versus not being licensed.
Yeah.
So in addition to having usually something like 2,000 hours of supervision, you also have to take a licensing exam, just showing that you're competent and know how to do that. And psychiatrists have to do the same thing, but it's a different exam because they're medical doctors. Research psychologists just do research. They don't work with actual people unless it's in the course of doing their research.
Okay.
So I was working with people who had strokes and had language processing problems after stroke, and we were trying to understand how the brain worked based on how these folks were speaking or not speaking. And then we would say, okay, is there some way we can route around that? And we were trying to help them learn to be better, at processing language. But I never got those 2,000 hours of supervised clinical training, and
Okay.
I never took a licensing exam. And so for that reason, I call myself a coach. However, so what happened with my career is I actually had a long career as a researcher and also as a software developer.
Okay.
Because I am neurodivergent and have ADHD, and so I do a lot of things. But anyway, so I have the research background. And what's interesting about this is when I was in high school, I remember my father said to me, he said, you need to think about what you want to do with your life. And I thought and thought and thought. I didn't know anything, right? I was in high school. And I was like, I want to be a psychologist. So, I went off to school and decided to major in psychology, which I actually did really, really love. And by the way, what I loved about it was the individual differences. That was the thing that just really excited me about psychology.
Yeah.
And then I didn't know it, but I was at a school that didn't have a clinical program. And so the professors routed me. They knew research, right? So they routed me into research PhD programs. About halfway through my research program, I was in graduate school 85 through 90, 1985 to 1990. The American Psychological Association had this big discussion, I'll call it. It was really a fight about who can call themselves a psychologist. I am actually not allowed to call myself a psychologist.
Hmm.
So I can call myself a research psychologist, but I cannot call myself just a psychologist
Interesting.
because I don't have a license.
Yeah.
And so, all right, so I have this whole career, and at some point I realized I wanted to do what I'm doing now. And I thought, you know what, I should get I should get the clinical training and all that. I was in my 50s at the time, so I was in my early 50s, and I thought that my research training would be something that I could take into, and just say, okay, I need this clinical supervision and training in clinical work. And the state said, no, we're not going to give you credit for any of your PhD, and you have to start all over again. And I was like, I'm in my 50s. I just want to start doing my thing. And so I decided that I was just going to call myself a coach because there are no requirements for being a coach, which is both a blessing and a curse, right? My clients can't get insurance reimbursement for my services because of that. And I feel bad about that. But on the other hand, I have freedoms that people who have licenses don't necessarily have. And so coaches, there are coaching organizations that provide certifications. So for example, there's an ADHD coaching. I think there are 2 different ADHD coaching certification programs. And so you can get certified in that. But there really aren't any, it's kind of the Wild West out there.
Okay.
And so I hope that sort of explains the difference between them. And my journey is actually, you can see where I got to with that. But, I do worry about it all the time. I try so hard to be very mindful of the fact that I don't want to do harm. I want to help people. I pull consultants in. I have friends who are psychologists, and I'm constantly asking them questions. What do you think about this? What do you think about that? Is this appropriate? What would you do here? And I do a lot of referring out for things that are just definitely beyond my training.
Okay. It seems like there's at least some risk of coaches not knowing what they're doing, right? Because if
Absolutely.
it's unregulated or not
Correct?
very regulated, anyone can be a coach and anyone can say
Yeah.
it. So how do people differentiate between someone like you that actually has a firm grounding in what you're coaching versus somebody who's just saying they're a coach? I mean, obviously you look into people, like you want to do your
Yeah.
research on somebody, but do you have any other advice for that?
It's super hard. The answer is it's super hard. And I this is a case where I definitely think looking at recommendations from other people who have worked with them is really critical. Um, and in particular, recommendations from people who you know and trust, right? Because anyone can make a recommendation. And one of the things that's just so important to remember too is it's about goodness of fit
Mm-hmm.
between you and the person you're working with. And so, this is something that actually took me a while to understand. The way I came to this, by the way, is that both my children are autistic, and I was having a hard time navigating like how to support them and so on. And I thought, well, my goodness, if I have a PhD in this and I'm having such a hard time with this, like what must it be like for other folks? And so I thought maybe I could help, given I have I've learned through experience as well as through my scientific training.
Yeah.
Um, so there are, I think looking at things like that is important. Like, how did they come to be a coach? What kind of experiences have they had? Talking to them and finding out, like, just ask, what's your approach? How do you do this? How do you run your business? And think, is that something that feels like it would work for me, or does it not feel like it would work for me? I tend to be very pragmatic in my approach, so I'm trying to figure out like how are we going to solve problems here and so on. If the work you need to do is, diving into your past and your childhood and how that might have an impact on what's happening to you now, I'm not the right person for that. And I would refer you to a really good psychologist or somebody with appropriate therapeutic training, social worker or, an LCPC. There are lots of therapists,
Yeah.
right? There are these different classifications, again, super confusing for people. And so I definitely think asking around for recommendations is really probably your best way to find somebody.
Okay. Yeah, and honestly, at least I'm of the opinion that just because somebody is a therapist or a psychologist or psychiatrist that can actually even prescribe things doesn't mean they actually are great at what they're doing. So I
Correct.
think even people with the right titles need to be vetted correctly, right?
Well, and it is about goodness of fit. So I have a friend, a really good friend, and she loves like Jungian exploring psychology and, understanding, sort of literary influences on the psyche and things like that. And like I said, I'm very pragmatic. So I always say I like what I call do therapy, but she likes talk therapy. So if I'm making a recommendation for her, I'm going to think about somebody who can explore that stuff with her because that's what she wants to do and that's what resonates for her. So some of this is about goodness of fit, like the approach you use. Is that something that, if I use a particular approach, is that something that's going to work for you? It may not.
Yeah. We're gonna talk about, autism, ADHD. I've always been I have ADHD. Like
Hmm.
it's been
Join
pretty
the club.
obvious. M- we'll get into this later, but luckily at least in my opinion, or we can just go into it now. I wasn't prescribed medication for
Hmm.
ADHD as a child. My parents
Hmm.
didn't allow it, and I'm actually very grateful for that because I look at some of the substances that are used to treat ADHD. One of them is Adderall, and I did take that in my 20s. I
Mm.
got prescribed that, and I actually consider it one of the harder drugs that I've taken.
Oh, wow.
I think it's an intense drug, and it's
Hmm.
very prone to addiction. Um, After that experience, I know I should not take uppers at all because I have a very addictive personality when it comes to anything that gives me more energy. So,
Mm.
um,
So were you just taking higher and higher doses or what was going on?
yeah, I was prescribed. I can't remember the exact dosage that I was prescribed anymore, but yeah, in doing some research for this episode, I actually asked some questions. I use AI. I'll ask AI a bunch of questions because it
Yeah.
is easier sometimes than going into all the individual websites. But I asked if there's a connection between uh, dysregulated sleep and ADHD, which I
There
found out there
definitely
definitely
is.
is. And I'm like, okay, that
Yes.
makes sense because at this point in my life, I don't, I don't even drink caffeine. I haven't drank caffeine in a few years. I don't take any stimulants or anything like that. But I'll be tired at 2 in the afternoon.
Mhm.
Sometimes I know that's because maybe I ate a meal that I shouldn't have ate. Some of the things that I did.
Mhm.
But I'll be tired. 2 PM. I'm like, I could take a nap right now, but I'll push through it. And then 10 o'clock rolls around and I'm like, okay, now I should be going to sleep. But I am wide awake and I can stay up until 3 or 4 in the morning sometimes
Mhm.
without any issue. This last weekend was one of those. I was caught up in something I was really interested in learning
Yeah.
about. And
Yeah.
one night I tried multiple times between midnight and when I actually fell asleep at 5:30 a.m. But each time my brain was just I was just thinking about things I couldn't sleep. So, um, yeah, what is as a coach and somebody who has a PhD uh in cognitive psychology, what is your opinion on drugs for ADHD?
So it's a great question, and I'm gonna actually I wanted to say some things about sleep,
Okay.
if you don't mind before,
Yeah, definitely.
and then I really do want to dive into that because it's important. Um, so and by the way, not getting enough sleep can make it exacerbates your ADHD symptoms. And so, sleep is a concern for a lot of people with ADHD. It's a huge concern. And for some people, it's the medication they're taking that basically makes it difficult for them to sleep. But I actually think there's something about the ADHD brain that makes it hard, to calm the brain down, for some people,
Yeah.
again. So I'm learning so much more about sleep recently. So one thing I wanted to say, the 2 p.m. thing, there's a hormone I think it's called adenosine, adenosine. And when adenosine washes through your brain, that's when you feel sleepy. And one of the things about human beings is we're very rhythmic, right? So
Yeah.
there's rhythms of life, like there's sleep and there's awake, right? And adenosine washes through your brain, and that feeling you get when you're just like, oh, I really need a nap, right? That is probably because adenosine is washing through your brain. What happens is it washes through your brain, and then your brain filters it out, but that's how you clean up all the mess that's getting made by just, being a brain navigating the world. And so sleep is how we clean our brain up, organize everything. So sleep is super, super important for that. And in fact, there's some thought that chronic sleep deprivation can lead over the long haul to more plaques and tangles, for example, in brains. And so anyway, that's thing one. So and people getting sleepy like right after lunchtime or so, that's actually one of those natural cycles. So if you look at cultures like Greece or Spain, you'll find that many cultures have an afternoon nap built into their day,
Yeah.
like a siesta, right?
Yeah.
And so the modern world doesn't let us do that. We have this idea that we're supposed to work for 8 hours during the day and there's no break in the middle. And that's actually not how human beings really evolved. And so that cycle of wake and sleep, it used to be before there was electricity. Here's another example. We would go to sleep at night and then we would wake up at some point in the middle of the night and, play cards or, do some chores or whatever, and then go back to sleep, and they would call it the second sleep.
Yeah.
And you'll see reference to that in a lot of ancient texts. And so that's sort of how we evolved, was that way. And then, but then electricity came along, and we could keep things light and bright and keep doing stuff. And so we compressed our sleep schedules, but our bodies evolved in an older world. And so we're trying to force our bodies into that, and it may not work for our bodies. That's one thing I wanted to say. Second thing is that people have different what are called chronotypes. And it turns out that that stuff is genetically determined. So I myself am a night owl. I tend to get my best work done between about 10 p.m. and 1 a.m. That's really kind of my best time of day. Again, the world is not designed for people like me.
Yeah.
And, if I want to work in a company or whatever, like I've got to be up and ready to go at 8:30 and doing work, whether I was up from 10 to 1 or not.
Yeah.
And so I'm having to force my body I have to force myself to go to sleep early, which is not my natural rhythm, and wake up earlier than I would if I were doing my natural rhythm. And I remember when I was in grad school, a friend of mine said, she was a morning person and she had a son. And I said, Liz, how are you such a morning person? That's amazing. I wish I were a morning person. And she said, oh, you have kids and you become a morning person. So I thought, oh, great. So when I have kids, I'll become a morning person. And my husband, by the way, is also a night owl like me. And it was one of the things that bonded us together. Note to others, somebody needs to be a morning person in your house because otherwise it's very hard to get out of bed in the morning. But anyway, so we had kids, and guess what? I'm still a night owl. I really am.
Yeah.
And we also shift. Our sleep schedules shift as we age. And so teens and adolescents and young adults tend to have a later sleep cycle. And then it shifts as we get older to waking up early. So that's another piece. You have your chronotype, but then you also have just the stage of life you're in. So I just wanted to mention that there's a lot of biology behind sleep that our modern world doesn't allow us to address. And I think it's contributing to people not getting enough sleep and to the worsening of ADHD symptoms, but also anxiety and other things.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to mention that because I do think it's important. So back to your question about medication. So
Before we get into
yeah,
that,
yeah.
actually, would you be able to just explain what ADHD is?
It's a great question. So I have this thing here, this diagnostic and statistical manual,
Yeah.
right, that has all these characteristics of neurodevelopmental disorders, of which ADHD is one. And I'm just going to pull up the ADHD. Yeah, here we go. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which, by the way, I really hate that title because there's a significant subset of people with ADHD who are not hyperactive.
Yeah.
And that's the kind I have. I have what's called inattentive ADHD. So I'm just going to read the definition from this manual here. It is a persistent pattern of inattention and or hyperactivity and impulsivity that interferes with functioning or development, as characterized by inattention. And then they have 6 characteristics of inattention, like not giving close attention to detail, having difficulty sustaining attention, not always listening when spoken to, not following through on instructions, difficulty organizing things, reluctant to engage in tasks that require sustained mental effort, losing things necessary for tasks, easily distracted, often forgetful in daily activities. So you have to have 6 of those things, right? One thing you want to notice about all that, that's based on external behaviors, right? That's the external presentation. It doesn't get at why somebody has that. Also, I really hate it because it's all about the negative pieces of ADHD. There are positives to ADHD too. I find people with ADHD often are very good at big picture thinking, right? They see the big picture and they can figure out how the pieces fit together in a way that people don't have ADHD often they don't see the world that way. They see it a different way.
Yeah.
There are some profound strengths of ADHD, but this DSM doesn't talk about those. It just talks about how it has a negative impact on you. So then there's the second category of hyperactivity and impulsivity. This is fidgeting, leaving your seat when you're supposed to stay sitting down, running around and climbing. Obviously, if you're an adult, that may not apply as much. Unable to play or engage in leisure activities quietly, on the go, acting as if driven by a motor, talking excessively, blurting out answers, having difficulty waiting your turn, interrupting and intruding. And then there's, they say you have to have it before you were 12. You have to have it diagnosed before 12, but actually it's whether the symptoms were present before you were 12.
Okay.
And then present in more than one setting. So if somebody's got these problems only at school, that might be a problem of what a really wonderful friend of mine used to call dystechia and not some other thing. And then it has to interfere with your daily functioning, and it can't be explained by something else. So people with ADHD can either have inattentive type, hyperactive impulsive, or a combined type where they have both sets of symptoms.
Okay.
So so that was an answer to what ADHD, how they diagnose ADHD. And the thing is that it's a brain wiring difference. So I was telling you, like, this big picture thinking, this ability to attend to a wide array of things, being attentive to things besides what you're narrowly focused on, and having a hard time focusing in unless it's something you're really interested in.
Yeah.
So people with ADHD actually often have something called hyperfocus, where if it's something they're interested in, they can focus on it really, really well. which means they can explore it very deeply and really develop a wonderful, deep understanding that other people may not be able to. So these are some of the positive sides of ADHD, and we don't often hear about those sides.
Yeah.
The other thing I'll just say is boys. School's not friendly to boys. I actually hate how school is for boys. I have 2 boys of my own, and school was not easy for them because guess what? They wanted to get up and move around, and that's normal, right?
Yeah.
Sitting and not moving around in your classroom is something that a lot of little girls can handle. It's actually not great for them either, but they can do it. Little boys, they're just like, "Man, I can't do this. This is ridiculous. I can't pay attention." And
Yeah.
then the teachers will punish them and say, "You're not sitting in your seat, so I'm going to take away recess from you." Well, then they're not going to be able to pay attention at all. Like it's completely bonkers. And so some of this is unreasonable expectations that we have of kids for what they're supposed to be able to do during the day. There used to be a lot more hands-on instruction in school, and now it's much more aimed at worksheets and teaching you procedures for solving problems, but not like solving the problems in a real world problems.
Yeah.
So anyway, you can get me really going on a rant there, but I'll stop now.
Yeah, it's a lot of things you're saying are just connecting with me because I'm
Hmm.
very much big picture. Like
Yeah.
all the details, I'm often not too interested in the
Hmm.
details. Like they're just not as interesting to me. And but big picture, I'm great with. I can look at things and just like kind of zoom out and see things from just from an overview and kind of piece things together and even find connections that aren't necessarily there in a lot of people's eyes.
Yes. Yes. Those connections. That's a big deal, by the way,
Yeah,
because a lot of people don't see those connections, and you do, right?
yeah,
And they really genuinely don't see them until you bring them to their attention, and then they'll be like, "Oh, that's really interesting. I think
yeah.
there is a connection there."
And my girlfriend can attest to this. If I'm not interested in something, you can just keep repeating it and I will not hear it. But I get in these, like I was mentioning over the weekend, um, I was trying to learn how to create AI um, applications. And I'm not a developer, at least not much of one. I know a little bit of, you know, HTML, CSS, a little JavaScript, and I was just in it. Like I could
It's
not
fun,
think of
isn't it?
anything else. I had a friend in town who wanted me to come out, and I just couldn't pull myself away. Like nothing could
Mm.
take me away, and I didn't want to sleep. Right, I couldn't sleep. So it's yeah, very interesting, and I often have these. I often don't. I start saying something. It happened already in this interview, I'm pretty sure. I'll start saying something or ask a question, but it ends up being something else by the end of the question
Mhm.
because I have multiple thoughts going on at once, and
Yes.
sometimes, I mean, you only have one mouth, so you can only say one thing at a time, right? So I
Yeah.
can't always get a thought out the way that it's going on in my head. Um,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
yeah, it's very interesting. So, as a coach, what's your view on medication? I pulled you away from that a minute ago.
It depends. It depends on the situation.
Yeah.
So one of the things about the DSM that I do appreciate is they talk about whether it is interfering with the person's well-being, right? So if it's interfering with your well-being, then you can manage it in a lot of ways. One way that really is, I think, super important is managing it through exercise. Exercise is so important, and that's why I brought up kids not being able to get up and run around and use their bodies and
Yeah.
do things, right? Um, and by the way, boys do get diagnosed at higher rates for ADHD. And I feel like we're medicating the boy out of them, which
Mhm.
is terrible. Um, and so So there's exercise. Quite frankly, there's a lot of information about the importance of being in nature.
Mm.
So being outside, exposure to green or just natural environment is also helpful. I'll tell you a story about a friend of my son's, who had very severe ADHD. It was very severe, really, really interfered with his life.
Yeah.
And his mom actually is an herbalist. And so she's very smart about, how to optimize functioning using herbal supplements and so on. Um, they tried to manage his ADHD with just exercise and nature and, all that. It wasn't enough for him. He did need, I don't know what stimulant he took. And that's one thing I also do want to, let's put a pin in that. But the fact that one medication may be good for you, it would be a terrible medication for me.
Mm.
And a lot of times you'll have a bad experience with one, and then you're like, I don't want to go through that again. That was terrible. And so you're not willing to try the others, but they target different receptors, and so the effects can be different. Also, the chemical makeup of them is different, and so it just they can hit your system very differently.
Mm.
So, as an example, like some kids will take Ritalin and they'll be zombies, right? They're just like flat affect and, very focused. I mean, yeah, they got great focus now, right?
Yeah.
But they're actually not able to take in stuff, that's going on in the world. Like they're so focused on something, and they might even be rude if you try to interrupt them and so on. And so you like that's not a good either. The dose is wrong. So that's too much, honestly. If somebody's having those kinds of symptoms, that's too much. And so the dose might be wrong, or the formulation might be wrong for that person. So anyway, this friend of my son's, his mom was trying to figure out, how to help him. And so they did start trying. It took, I think they went through 4 or 5 different medications, finally found one that he could tolerate a small dose of, which helped him. But that he needs 2 hours of swimming every single day to
Yeah.
manage his ADHD. And actually, Michael Phelps, I don't know if you know that he has ADHD, and
Okay.
his mom got him into swimming because it helped with his ADHD.
Interesting.
And it was, so that's how he managed his ADHD, was through swimming. So this kid, this friend of my son's, that's how he managed it. And it's just something he has to manage his whole life. And so everybody's different is what I'll say. So some people do need the chemical assist. Some people can't tolerate it. And there are these different formulations. So just because one didn't work doesn't mean another might not be helpful.
Yeah.
So those are a few things. But I do think that nature deficit disorder, sleep disorder, right? Activity, movement, restriction disorder. I'm just making up terms here. But it's really important to remember that these we didn't evolve sitting at a desk, for 8 hours a day. Like we were out in the world doing things and so on. And so we are now in a world that expects very different things from us. And some of us just aren't wired that way.
Yeah. When my parents decided not to medicate me, I was the class clown. I was always getting in.
Mhm.
I was kicked out of class all the time.
Mm.
I was in a little private school in Indiana, in Illinois first, and I was just always getting in trouble. It seemed to start after 4th grade. Like third
That's
grade, I
common.
was fine, and then 4th grade and after, I just couldn't keep still, and I didn't want to do anything the teachers wanted me to, and I wasn't dumb. I could still do the math that they wanted to.
Mhm.
Earlier, they thought I was being tutored because I actually knew more of the math than they were teaching, but
Mhm.
I
So you
hated.
might have been bored. You might have been bored.
Yeah, yeah, and that's something I'm very critical of the school system, the education system in our country.
Mhm.
I think it's completely inadequate. I think it targets the wrong things. I think we're we're taught to learn facts
Yes.
and things like that when we're younger, but I love learning. It's actually one of my passions, but I didn't really learn that until I was in my
Mm.
mid-20s. And I was like, "Oh my gosh, I just love learning." And I think one of the things that many teachers in America fail at is they don't inspire interest. So you have to do this, you have to learn this, you're supposed to learn this, but they don't create that, like, just interest in and of itself. Like, this
Mm.
is fun to learn this stuff. Like, this is just interesting. And um yeah, like learning dates in history. I love history, but when you're in 5th grade, learning the dates of different historical events is extremely uninteresting.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Yeah. I would like to, um I think you are so right, and what it brought up for me was two different things. So one is, um, there's a difference between, I didn't talk about this earlier, but one of the things I am is what's called a certified RDI consultant. Relationship Development Intervention is what RDI stands for. And the two co-founders of RDI, one of them is Steve Gutstein, and he has this concept that he talks about, which is static intelligence, which is like facts. It's things that don't change. There
mhm.
is a right answer. And then there's another kind of intelligence that he calls dynamic intelligence. And this is the ability to take in new information and flexibly adapt your behavior based on new information, and and also to problem solve, right? So taking in lots of bits of information and solving problems. So it's dynamic intelligence that allows us to navigate the world. If we only have static intelligence, then it's very when something different happens, it's jarring, and it's hard to know how to take it in if you don't have the ability to say, "Oh, that's some new information. That will inform how I think about the world now." And so this difference between dynamic and static thinking is really important, and we want to be dynamic thinkers. And some people are very good at static thinking, memorizing facts, memorizing dates.
Yeah.
Um, you know, and honestly, the way we teach, for example, math, a lot of times it's procedural. Do this, then do this, then do this, then do this, then do this, as opposed to why. Like I attended a training on how to teach mathematics, and the guy who was doing the training kept relating it to the real world. So when he was talking about fractions, he would talk about a pizza, right? And he would say, when when you multiply fractions, right? You're going to have, what did he say? Half of 3/4. So 1/2 times 3/4. So usually when people are thinking about how to do a fraction like that, then you have a procedure you go through from, getting a common denominator and all that stuff. And so, but what he said is, think about a pizza, right? You've got 3/4 of a pizza, and then you divide it in half. And that is the answer to the multiplication problem.
Yeah.
So think about it in real world terms, and it blew my mind and completely changed the way I think about math. Singapore math is a way of teaching mathematics that actually does more of this sort of visualizing what the mathematics is referring to. And instead of focusing on those procedures, it's helping you understand what's underneath the procedures. And we don't teach that way. And so now I want to defend the teachers of our nation. They have been driven to what they do by standardized approaches to teaching.
Yeah.
I live in Maryland, outside of Washington, D.C. The curriculum here in Maryland is defined so much that teachers actually do not have the flexibility to, even in a given week, change what they are teaching to their students, or they get downgraded when they're assessed. So the state sets the curriculum, and they have to teach to the curriculum, and each county has its own way of structuring that. But anyway, the teachers don't have any flexibility now. When my dad was growing up, that was not how it was. The teachers, and it was kind of the Wild West, right? So teachers just taught, what they thought the kids needed to know, but they were allowed to customize based on the kids in their classroom. So if you realized your kids didn't know, I don't know, how to do fractions, then you would actually spend some time making sure they knew how to do fractions. Now, if they don't know, you got to go get tutoring or something because we're covering this topic on this day.
Yeah.
And this is breaking it's breaking our creativity. It's breaking our children. It's terrible because the very thing that made America amazing was that we encouraged people to learn and be excited by learning. And we've made it into a memorization game. And that's not how we're going to be creative and solve hard problems, right? So I actually think we're at kind of a crisis point with education in our country. It's not working, and it's not working for a lot of kids. And the stress and anxiety that kids feel is their way of telling us this isn't working for me. So, when the Surgeon General says we're having a national crisis of anxiety and depression, then we need to listen to that. Why is that? It's because we're not teaching our kids the things they need to know to survive.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely don't think teachers in themselves are the problem. I think many
Right. They're
teachers
in a
want to
system.
teach. I think
Yeah.
I've had the opinion, and it doesn't take much convincing for me to believe that ultimately government and politicians are a lot of the blame for any problem. Like, I don't think the Department of Education is actually a good thing, personally.
It could be.
Yeah.
It could be, right? If they weren't, that's what I think is so frustrating for me, is that we need to trust our teachers to do their job and to understand their own students, and we need to give them the flexibility to teach the students who are in their classroom. And I think lots of people talk about pendulums swinging back and forth, and I think the pendulum is very far in the direction of we are mandating that you do this. And I do want to say that I do think this came in the wake of No Child Left Behind,
Yeah.
which I think it was from the best of intentions. They had good intentions. I grew up in New Mexico, and New Mexico is the worst state as far as educational outcomes in the entire country. We're below everybody. And I think it's good that there is some way to talk to teachers or to make sure that those kids in New Mexico are getting an education that's as good as what the kids are getting, in one of the states that's, at the top of the list. Maryland used to be there. We're not there anymore.
Yeah.
But, I think that they had good intentions, which is how do we help these kids in New Mexico? But then the way they did it had these very dramatic and terrible unintended consequences. And I think that happens so often in politics where their hearts are in the right place. They're trying to do the right thing. But then the solution they come up with is like, oh my goodness, this is not helping.
Yeah, they're often offering simple solutions to complex problems, which
Right,
rarely work.
right.
Complex
That's
problems
right.
usually require complex, multifaceted solutions in general.
Yeah, I agree.
So, um, what is autism? I know you have a book that is this autism. It's for
Yes.
clinicians and the general public, but um, when I've explored this topic, it's pretty complex to figure out if somebody has more noticeable symptoms of it, it's easier to diagnose. But it seems like some people could be on the spectrum, and it's not very well known. They could go their whole lives without being diagnosed with this.
So, as an example, my father actually was diagnosed at the age of 64
Hmm.
with
Wow.
autism. So it was in the wake of my own children getting their diagnosis. And at that point, so this was back in, let me think about this, 2006. So my younger son was 4 and my older son was 9. And my younger son was actually diagnosed first because he was more prototypically autistic, right? And we could see he was having such a hard time. We could see it. I knew honestly, I knew something was up with him even when I was pregnant with him. I could feel the difference. And so honestly, I was waiting until he was 4 and could get a reasonable diagnosis. Prior to that, kids are just all over the map, and it's very hard to get a reasonable diagnosis. And so at 4, I finally was like, okay, he's 4. We can get this kid some help. We actually had at the age of 2 self-referred him to it's called Child Find. It's part of the educational system, but there's a federal mandate that children with disabilities be identified. The problem is that, as you just said, some kids are more clearly, autistic from the outside. Very often these are kids who maybe are having trouble learning to talk, which by the way isn't part of the diagnostic criteria. And they may be having repetitive movements. So the classic one people think about is, flapping, or head banging or twirling. There's these repetitive motions that people, like if you've got a kid doing that stuff, you're thinking something is definitely going on here. And so the parents take in for a diagnosis. Those kids have a lot of co-occurring stuff. So language disorder is definitely something that you do see it co-occurring with autism. So a substantial number of autistic people also have language learning delays. But they're co-occurring, right? So ADHD is co-occurring. Anxiety is co-occurring. There are actually some physical things like connective tissue disorders like Ehlers-Danlos or that's the one that I see most often. So you can have these medical conditions that co-occur with the autism, and people get very focused on those. For the younger kids, if you have somebody with really, really severe ADHD, then you're thinking, wow, this kid really needs some help and they need help fast. Your ADHD, I think it sounds like it wasn't so severe that people would have said there was a problem until you were a little older.
All my teachers said I had a problem
Oh,
when I
they
was
did?
when I was
Even
in grade
younger.
school. My parents. So it was in the 90s. I was born in
Mm-hmm.
85.
Mm-hmm.
So I must have had the problem started around 95. And
Okay.
I do think around that time, we were probably overdiagnosing ADHD in schools. Like
Mm-hmm.
like in the school I was in, like all the boys were on ADHD medication.
See, that's broken.
Yeah.
It's like we need to let our boys learn the way they need to learn, right?
Yeah. And who knows
I
what that
could
does to brain development too, because
mm-hmm.
your brain's developing until you're almost 30.
Your brain is developing your whole life, actually. So there's a concept called neuroplasticity. And here's the deal. The minute your brain stops changing is the minute you're dead.
Hmm.
Your brain is always taking in new information and figuring it out and rewiring itself in the face of that new information. So there's constant rewiring. And if you don't reinforce certain pathways, they go away. Those
Yeah.
connections are lost. You can regain them by re-exposing yourself to, that particular kind of stimuli. But yeah, your brain is always growing and changing. Now, it is true that there are certain critical periods. And the way this works is that when you're born, your brain is just this sort of undifferentiated soup, right? And it's just a bunch of neurons. They're all, messed up in there. There isn't a lot of structure. And as you're exposed to new information, your brain starts organizing. Your occipital cortex develops, your motor cortex develops, your language centers develop, your prefrontal cortex starts developing. All these different areas of your brain start differentiating their function. And that's partly genetically driven
Mm-hmm.
and partly environmentally driven. So, for example, if you were blind, the cells in your occipital cortex actually, other senses would be feeding back to those cells. So, it depends on what the inputs are.
Yeah.
But, you know, as you age, there are moments when you have a flush of neural development and growth, and then pruning, where you get rid of those connections that aren't useful to you anymore. Also, at the same time, your glial cells are supporting the structures that are developing, and they make it easier for certain pathways to try, so for certain neurons to be connected, and those pathways get faster and faster. As you get older, you have more and more of these structural cells holding things in place. And the neurons can still reconnect, but they have to operate within the structure
Okay.
that's holding them in place.
Interesting.
So I just wanted to clarify, that we are learning our whole lives. But there are age differences. So, and I did want to mention also that there are periods of this growth and pruning. Toddlers have it. It often happens around age 9 or 10. There's another. Adolescence is huge. So it's as big a reorganization as toddler. Um, Big reorganization happening during that time. And then your frontal lobes start connecting up with all the rest of your brain during adolescence and into your late 20s. And by the way, if you have a neurodevelopmental difference, that connection might be happening into your 40s, right? So, these timelines that we tell parents are actually, I think it puts a desperation in parents that is not helpful. There's always the ability to rewire to some extent, right? To some extent. And, I know for me, when my older son wasn't learning to talk, I was terrified because I had been taught there was a critical period. And if he wasn't speaking before 10, he was never going to speak.
Mm.
That is untrue. That is untrue. Kids can learn to speak, but it's harder. So, because you have more structure in there, you have to work your way around. So it's harder.
Yeah. I I listened to another interview you did, and uh, you basically advocated for taking a year off before college for neurodivergent people, and
Yeah.
I actually think I should have done that. I didn't really have direction after when I finished up high school. It's like, oh, what do you want to do? I'm like, I don't know. What is there to do?
Yeah. Many kids don't know. Yeah.
I was told, oh yeah, you could be a lawyer, you can be an accountant. I'm like, none of that sounds fun. Like I don't want to do any of that. And um, yeah, so I think that's a good advice. And you were talking about like there's actual programs that people
Mm,
can get in to get their like executive functioning
yeah.
um up to speed, or I don't know, up to speed is the word, but better executive functioning. Can you
Well,
talk a little
just
bit about
getting
that?
things more connected, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, there are programs like that. And one of the things I'll offer, I've been talking about development, and they call these things neurodevelopmental delays. And when I was younger, I was like, is that just code for they're never going to develop it and they don't want to say it? And so the parents don't get completely depressed, or is it actually a delay? And as I've gotten older and seen people develop through the lifespan and into adulthood, I can tell you that for some people it's definitely a delay, and
Mhm.
that those systems do come on later. Um, and so one thing that, waiting a year does is it gives more time for your brain to connect up. So the frontal lobes, one of the things that's so complicated about it is it it develops internally, and you are capable of deep thought and so on, in adolescence. And this is one of the challenges of adolescence, but it's not fully connected with the rest of your brain. So implementing action, you can know what the right thing is to do, but making yourself do it the wiring isn't fully there. And
Yeah.
so that's part of what's coming in. And one of the things I can say, just watching my own older son, he is now 26, and his executive functioning is improving dramatically. It's incredible to watch it come online.
Yeah.
Like, I'm like, whoa, he's remembering to do stuff like I don't have to remind him. He can solve complex problems and implement them in a way that was very hard for him when he was younger. And he's not stupid. He's very smart.
Yeah.
But he just had a hard time. He would get overwhelmed by big tasks like that and have a hard time breaking them down into the parts and then implementing them to completion. Now he's doing it great. And some of that was support from executive functioning people who let him work with his brain. So I think this is such an important piece of executive functioning coaching, is that what works for my brain might not work for your brain. And so you have to come up with a strategy that's going to work for you. For me, I have to write everything down. If I write it down, I'll remember it. But if I don't write it down, in one ear and out the other.
Yeah.
For my husband, he needs a visual of it. So he can write it down or he can type it. As long as he can see it, then he can remember it. My son's a doer. He's somebody who has to do to remember. And so, that's just how his brain is wired. And so the things we had to do for him to help him learn those executive functions had to do with how do we, find some system that works for him that will allow his brain to do the executive functioning the way he needs to. So some of it is just developmental, years, right? Years of experience. And some of it is coaching. Some coaches get very rigid about, we have to do, use the colored folders and I don't know, divided binders and all these things. My son actually hated all the divided binders because he would just take the papers and cram it in, right? He was just like, okay, I got a paper, and he'd throw it in. And then, at the end of the week, I'd have a bunch of crumpled papers in the backpack and folders where they, could have gone, but that was just more than he could deal with. And so that wasn't a good system for him, right?
Yeah.
It would have been better to just say, put it all in this folder and go organize it when you get home or something, instead of making him do it in the moment. But the reason I'm saying that is these programs, so there's a gap year. And I'll just say there are certain cultures in which that gap year is part of their culture. So for example, Seventh-day Adventists have a year where you go off and they go on a mission, and they're living away from their families, but in the protective world of the church, and they're having to solve a lot of real world problems because they're living without the support of their parents. They've got they're living in people's homes and getting support. But it struck me at some point that was kind of a brilliant innovation
Yeah.
because everybody has to take a gap year, and it's not viewed as a problem. It's just what you do. Likewise, in Israel, everybody has to serve time in the military, and they have 2 years of service. It's mandatory for everybody, which is essentially a gap year.
Yeah.
It's just in a military environment. And so, the more you can normalize stuff like that, I think the easier it is for people to say, you know what, that might be a good choice for me right now. Because it's actually a good choice for a lot of people. My own sister actually tried college, and there were a lot of things going on there, but she had a band scholarship, and it was just too much to manage being in the band and taking classes, because it's really a full-time job to be in the marching band. And
Yeah.
so she ended up dropping out and worked for 2 years. And then when she was super clear what she wanted to do, she went back to college and rocked it. So, I think the gap year is, it's really a shame we tell kids that they're supposed to go to college right out, because I actually think they'd be more available to be excited about learning and know how to take advantage of the amazing things we can do in a college environment. So yes, there's programs like Dynamy is one. There's one called College Living Experience. There's just a whole bunch of these different programs where these students can get experience being out in the world, but having, people who are coaching them through developing strategies that will work for them.
Yeah. With your son being 26, it reminds me, I feel like I started to get things together around 27 and 28 years old.
Mm,
Um, I had a decent job at the time. I got a decent job around the age of 28. I When I look back on my life, I feel like I wasted a bunch of time. Like I feel like in school, I don't feel like I learned anything from 4th grade until well past high school. I'm sure I did. There's just nothing stands out as like, oh, I learned from this, from this class or whatever. And after college or after high school, my parents helped me with college, so they sent me to college because that's what you're supposed to do.
mm-hmm.
And I went back and forth. I had trouble making it to classes. I had trouble like really applying myself.
Mm,
And then in my mid-20s, I decided to go back and pursue a biology degree.
mm.
At that time, I had already wasted so much time that I felt this like pull in two different directions. Like I should be making money and I should be
Oh, yeah.
trying to go to school. And in the end, I didn't finish my bachelor's degree, and it worked out. I, got a decent job and um, continued at the job. But I've always felt like a fairly late bloomer. Like I feel like
Mhm.
it's not about like intelligence or anything. It's just that I feel like I haven't gotten crap figured out until later, and there's a big part of me that like I make a little music on the side,
Mm,
and I don't feel any I don't feel a need to have music released already. Like I feel like if I release music in my 40s, I'm perfectly okay with that. Like nothing
mhm,
about doing things that are supposed to be, what you're doing when you're in your 20s, releasing music, being in a band. I'm not in a band, I just make electronic music, but
mm,
I don't mind doing that at a later age. And um, I read a ton, and I don't mind that I'm learning a lot of. I just love learning, so I don't mind doing that at a later age. Oh, there's a
mhm.
book I should have read when I was 25. I'll read it now.
Read it now.
I don't
Yeah,
mind.
exactly.
So
Exactly.
I do like that quite a bit.
Can I would love for you to reframe what you're saying about wasting time. I don't think you were wasting time. I think you were learning different things than other people your age were. And, you it's your body was doing what you needed to do to become who you are now.
Yeah,
And so I really hope you can sort of take away this idea that the world doesn't know how to support somebody who has a different set of needs in fourth through high school, right? Fourth grade through high school. You
yeah,
had a different way of learning different needs, and nobody was meeting them. And so you were trying to figure out how to meet those needs yourself. And, your parents were probably trying to figure out how to help you too.
yeah,
Um, but the world doesn't make it easy for a kid like you who's out of the box. But you were learning and you were growing in a way that made you who you are now,
yeah.
right?
Yeah, I just don't
So
feel like the school system wasn't really
helped
teaching
you.
me much.
Yeah.
Like I
Yeah.
wrestled, and I think that was a
Mm-hmm.
good experience.
Mm-hmm.
I actually am friends with multiple people that I developed friendships with at that point. So
Right.
great
Right.
experience in that regard. Even though I look back on that, I'm like, why did I put myself through that physical hell sometimes?
But you know what? That wrestling is such a great sport, because it's so physical,
Yeah,
right? It's so physical, and um, honestly, a lot of people, and especially boys, need proprioceptive input, which is just like um, it's like joints. Messages from your joints is sort of information about how you're holding your body in space. And they need that sort of deep pressure and pounding in order for their senses to develop so that they can be at home in their bodies.
Yeah.
So you were doing this thing that allowed you to be at home in your own body. That's a huge deal,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, wrestling, another thing that's interesting about wrestling is there are other sports where you're competing one-on-one, but wrestling has this you're part of a team, but when you go out on the mat, it's
Mm-hmm.
just you and your opponent. Like there's
Mm-hmm.
nobody else. So there's no, oh, that person dropped the ball, so that's why we lost. It's like, no, I
Yeah.
lost because I didn't train hard enough, or I didn't, and I was not a great wrestler by any means. But
Mm-hmm.
um, yeah, it's there is this sense of like, this is me out there, and it's up to me whether I win or lose, or
Interesting.
you could still win as a team. Like there's a thing called a duel where like the team scores for the individual matches get added up together and that,
Mm.
whatever team, whatever school can win the overall duel. But as
Mm-hmm.
far as your match goes, it's just a one-on-one
Mm-hmm.
match, which is it has a unique quality, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, and actually, a lot of kids with neurodevelopmental differences do well with sports like that. Martial arts is another one that
Mm,
they
yeah.
tend to do well in. Running is actually really good, and swimming. Those are sports where it's you against yourself,
Yeah.
and maybe against one other person, but it's about you and whether you've done the training and done the work. So yeah, that's a really important observation.
Well, and that idea of competing with yourself is so important too. I think a lot of I don't think this is just neurodivergent people, but I think almost everybody grows up comparing themselves. I mean,
Of
it's
course.
nurtured
Of
in high
course.
school essentially to compare yourself to other people,
Yeah.
and it's our social nature to compare ourselves to others.
Mhm.
But when you learn how to just compete against yourself and be better than you were yesterday rather than trying to be what the other person is, is, oh,
Mhm.
I see that person and they're here, I want to get there. Maybe you're not, whatever you're trying to size up with that other person, maybe you haven't done the work that person has or whatever it
Right.
might be. So you start competing against yourself.
Mhm.
And I mean, it's easy to win, right? Like you can always be better than you were the day before.
Not always.
But
Sometimes
there's
you're having a bad
no
day.
guaranteed way to be better than somebody else's,
Right.
and you don't have to be. Like everyone has their own unique skills and viewpoints and
Mhm.
yeah, everyone has something I think special about them, special about
Mhm.
their ability to navigate the world or see the world. So
Yeah.
I really do think it's important to compete against yourself and not compare
I love
yourself to
that.
others all the time.
Yeah, there's a Mark Twain quote that I actually have on my wall over there, which is comparison is the thief of joy.
Mm, yeah.
So, I I never answered your question about what is autism.
Oh,
Do you want me to answer that?
yeah, sure.
Okay. So I'll go back to the DSM here, which is not the most neurodiversity affirmative in its language, as you heard with the ADHD. But uh, uh, autism is a, neurodevelopmental disorder that has two areas that they look at. One is social communication, and then the other one is uh, what are called restricted and repetitive behaviors, and they're often um, abbreviated as RRBs, is what they call them. So I am trying to find autism in here, and oddly, I have not bookmarked it. But anyway, here it is. So the social piece, the social communication piece, there are three areas. The first one is what we call reciprocity. So reciprocity, my co-author Donna Henderson likes to talk about a ping pong game, right? You're playing ping pong and you hit the ball and the other person hits it back. And if the goal of the game is to hit the ball back and forth as many times as possible, as opposed to hitting it off the table so the other person loses, then that's sort of what we mean about reciprocity. So if somebody hits the ball to you and you just watch it, bounce off on the floor, or you just ignore it, right? Then the other person's like, I just sent a ball your way and we're not actually engaging with anything. So being able to pick up on the other person just sent a communication my way, nonverbal or verbal, and then you respond in some way with this idea of keeping the conversation going back and forth. So that's reciprocity. The second thing is nonverbal communication. And this is things like facial expressions, gestures. You can see, your listeners can't see this, but I talk with my hands a lot. And there was actually a really funny research study I participated in where they tied your hands behind your back and looked at what it did to your speech patterns. And I became completely unable to speak if I couldn't use my hands. So some people use gesture very effectively. I think I honestly use it as a cue for speaking for me. But there's a lot of information in gesture. So for example, if I'm doing smooth flowing gestures, that makes you feel one way about me. But if I'm doing sharp, jabby gestures, that makes you think that I'm having a different emotional experience than, those. So communicating how you are feeling. And then, like I said, your facial expression. So some people have this very flat affect, right? They just always kind of look the same. And people misinterpret that as they are even-tempered, or they're doing fine. So my older son is actually somebody he's very calm, and it took me way too long to realize that actually in many cases he was completely shut down, but you'll never see it on his face. You'll never see, he just always has that same expression. And then there's tone of voice. So, there's a construct called prosody, and that's the melody and rhythm of language. And so when you're listening to me, like the phrases as I'm speaking them have a melody to them and a rhythm and a pacing, right? And the amount of pitch excursions and things like that give you clues about what I'm saying. I could go, that was actually the kind of thing I studied in grad school, so I'm going to rein myself in because I could have too much fun talking about that. But that's another aspect of social communication. So being able to interpret other people's nonverbals, and also communicating your state with your nonverbals. Then the third one is relationship understanding how to keep a relationship going, understanding that if you continually abandon your friend when you've made plans and don't show up, that eventually they're going to be like, yeah, maybe we're not getting together anymore because you keep forgetting or something like that, and not apologizing. So just sort of not understanding how to maintain a relationship. A lot of autistic people are very good at making friends, but they have a hard time keeping them over the long haul because in every relationship is stress, and there are going to be differences of opinion and navigating. What do you do when you disagree with somebody? How do you process that? How do you work that into the context of your relationship? And how do you keep moving forward? So those are the social communication pieces. And you have to have all three. You have to have challenges in all three of those areas. Okay. Then there are these, what I called RRBs, but restrictive and repetitive behaviors. One is those motor movements we talked about very early in this conversation. So things like flapping, twirling, pacing back and forth. And I think it's really important to remember, since you have ADHD, you'll probably relate to this. A lot of people with ADHD actually have stims that are designed to help them stay regulated. And one of the most common ones I see is the leg jiggle, right? Where you're sitting and your legs kind of going up and down, and you're doing it. A lot of people will do that to just stay regulated or awake, frankly. Yeah. And so, but that would count as a repetitive movement, for example. But, for people who are diagnosed later, it might be something really subtle because they've realized, oh, if I flap, people think that's, people stare at me funny. And so maybe what I'm going to do instead, I love this one. We surveyed a lot of autistic adults and asked them, like, what are your, repetitive behaviors? And one of them I loved was tooth tapping. So they have their
Hmm.
mouth closed, and they'll just like do little tiny taps to a rhythm or something like that, just to keep themselves focused. It's just a
Yeah.
little repetitive behavior. But there are other things too that count as these repetitive behaviors, like skin picking. So people who have trouble with that, or trichotillomania, where they'll pull their hair out, that can count in that category. So that, lining up toys is one we think of in autism, but that actually, a lot of people who get diagnosed later, maybe they're super neat, maybe they organize their closet in a very particular pattern or something like that. Anyway, that's one. The second one is flexibility. So we were talking earlier about dynamic versus static intelligence.
Hmm.
Dynamic thinking is flexibility. It's another way of thinking about flexibility. There are some autistic people who have a lot of trouble with dynamic thinking. They really focus on the static things. And when you change a little bit about the world, it's extremely disorienting for them. And so they have a hard time navigating those little changes. So difficulty with flexibility is the second category. The third one is highly restricted or fixated interests that are abnormal in intensity or focus. So this is where you were talking about being really interested in the AI, generating an AI thing. Hyperfocus like that is actually quite common in ADHD as well as in autism.
Okay.
But that passion for exploring something deeply is an amazing part of autism, but it can make it hard for you to get together with your friend, or
Yeah.
just it can make it hard for you to remember to eat dinner. My brother-in-law tells a story about finding SimCity, and this was a really long time ago, discovered it and played it for a couple of hours and got up to go to the bathroom and realized that actually he had been there for 14 hours playing this game and hadn't noticed that he needed
Yeah.
to get up. So that's a little intense, but I think any of us who've gotten into a video game can relate to
Yeah.
it. But those interests might be something that for girls seem socially acceptable, like horses, being really into horses, or being really into a K-pop star, or something like that. That's the kind of thing you might see in an autistic woman who has an intense interest. It's sort of socially acceptable to be into those things as a teenage girl, but
Yeah.
the intensity and focus of it might be pretty overwhelming. And then the last one is sensory differences. So being more or less sensitive to anything going on in the sensory environment. And we actually have 8 senses. So you're used to the 5, sight, sound, smell, taste, touch. But then there's also vestibular, which is how you're positioned in space, and movement through space. Vestibular system tracks that. I talked about proprioception when we were talking about wrestling. So that's
Hmm.
how your body is, the individual parts of your body are positioned. And then there's something called interoception, and that is how you're literally feeling. So if you are feeling queasy, right, that's a feeling you're having in your body. And or if you're, I don't know, you have to go to the bathroom, like the pressure on your bladder, that's a feeling, an internal sensation. Feeling a little warm, right, and realizing that you're feeling warm, or that your heart is beating quickly. Some people, a lot of autistic people, actually don't experience those sensations. They're under responsive to those sensations. And so they don't even realize, oh my goodness, like I'm nauseous and I need to get in the bathroom so I can throw up in the toilet, right? They just don't
Yeah.
even notice it until suddenly they're throwing up and they're like, what? What happened here? So that lack of interoception can be problematic. Some people are super sensitive. So if you find somebody has either this very responsive or not very responsive, or there can also be what's called sensory seeking, where they just really crave that kind of input. So people who love roller coasters or love spinning, right? Those are people who are seeking vestibular stimulation.
Yeah.
So anyway, those are now those RRBs that I just talked about, those restrict, the repetitive motor movements, the flexibility, the fixated interests, and then the sensory differences. These are 4 areas. You only have to have 2 of those. So you had to have all 3 of the social criteria, and then you had to have 2 of those RRBs to qualify as being autistic. So,
Okay.
so that's a very long answer to your question.
Yeah, it is very interesting. I've always wondered this for the sensory type stuff. Ever since I was a young child, I have this. I don't even know how you would describe it. It's like I'll get these random thoughts or
Mhm.
the idea of like sounds weird, like licking a fabric or
Mm.
something.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
very it'll make my like skin crawl, and I'll just get that randomly where
Oh,
I'm
yeah.
like that. It's bug. Is that kind of would
Oh,
that be
yeah.
considered that? Okay.
That's
I
a
have been asked
great.
if I'm. I have had friends ask me if I have might be on the spectrum for autism,
Uh-huh.
but I don't think I am. Like from
Uh-huh.
what I looked up, I don't think I am, but there are a
So you can
couple
have
things.
characteristics, right?
Yeah.
Like I actually have a lot of sensory stuff for me. I'm very
Yeah.
sensitive to noise. I have perfect pitch, so I can't stand it when people are out of tune.
Mm,
Um, and I have a hard time processing speech when it's noisy background. Yeah, I have a whole bunch of sensory stuff, but I'm not
yeah.
autistic. So you can have features of that for sure, and that's actually one reason in the book that our subtitle is a handbook or whatever for clinicians and everyone else,
Yeah.
right? And the reason is I have this friend who's a developmental pediatrician, and his name is Dan Shapiro, and one time he said to me, he said, to understand autism is to understand the human condition. I really believe that because every aspect of us in my clients, there's something that it just makes me have to do some research into, like, what is going on with that? So, for example, that example you just gave of, licking a fabric or something like that, that would be, and I'm curious if it's the texture or if it's the taste or if it's a combination of the two.
It's the texture,
Yeah.
and it's not like I'm actually licking a fabric.
No, it's
It's like
imagining
the
it.
thought of it. The
Yeah.
thought of it is like it's like, your tongue has those spikes, right? So it'll
Yes.
like your tongue would get stuck on something that it's not as prominent as a cat's, but
Yes.
we still have that to some degree. And yeah, the I would just get this thought of like, yeah, this like, oh, like
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
just bugs you, you
Yeah,
know?
I can totally relate to that, actually. It is kinda gross.
Yeah.
So, um, and yeah, so that's an example. I mean, that would be sensory avoidance, right?
Yeah.
I am betting most people are gonna find that particular sensation a little bit aversive. There's something about it, like, when you're describing it to me, I'm thinking, "Yeah, that sounds pretty revolting." Um, and, I have autistic friends who, can't stand polar fleece. There's something about the texture of polar fleece, and if they touch it, it it really upsets them, like,
Mm,
they feel like their skin is dirty, and they can't deal with it.
yeah.
So,
Interesting.
yeah.
Interesting. I'm a little bummed out because I have a hard stop in about 10 minutes, and I
Yeah.
feel like this conversation could go on for several more hours. So
Yeah.
I would
It is fun. I'm actually really enjoying talking to you.
I would love it if you would be willing to talk to me at a later point again.
Sure.
And I would love to read your book, Is This Autism, before then, and then we can
Okay.
even dive into that more.
I would love that.
Um, One question I do want to ask is this is related to dyslexia, because
Oh,
you said you
yeah.
work with that a bit too.
Mhm.
I've always wondered with dyslexia. Okay, so earlier we were talking about perception of color,
Mhm.
right?
Mm.
So uh, we could potentially both be seeing two different colors, but we're trained to see them as green. why why doesn't dyslexia work in a similar sense? Like, so you see the word science, right?
Mhm.
And sure, you might be not be seeing the word as I see it, but why can't you learn that that is the word science, or a longer word like remember?
Uh, all right. So there are different kinds of dyslexia. So one kind of dyslexia actually is related to auditory processing. So, for example, you may have different difficulty differentiating the "a" sound from the "eh" sound.
Okay.
So, bad versus bed. If you can't tell those two sounds apart, you can't tell whether what sound and then what letter goes with the "a" sound. So an "a" sound goes with an "a," right? An "eh" sound goes with an "e." If you can't tell the auditory things apart, you don't know how to attach the right letter to the sound you're hearing. So
Okay.
that's one issue. Um, there's another issue that has to do with visual perception. So this is the one most non scientists think about. The one I just talked about is actually the most common kind of dyslexia. Is you have difficulty matching the sounds you're hearing to the letter that you're seeing, and it's probably because you're not hearing the differentiation between them.
Okay.
Okay, so that's the most common kind of dyslexia. There's another kind of dyslexia where uh, when you see, then the way our visual system works is we actually have receptors that are designed to code orientation. So vertical versus horizontal versus diagonal, whatever. They're tuned very finely. And so you have those receptors. They feed into another layer of visual processing that combines the orientation with neighboring orientations. So if you have vertical plus horizontal, that's a capital H, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
If you're having trouble, so and an O is a whole bunch of different orientations all linked together, right? In a continuous circle. If so most people can do that. They can identify those shapes, circles, lines, curves, things like that. There's a next stage of visual processing where you take those shapes and integrate them. So if you think about a B versus a D, okay, you've got
Yeah.
a circle and a vertical line. And depending on which side of the vertical line that circle is on, right, you're going to have a B or a D. If something's messed up in that layer, you can't tell whether which side of the line the circle is on. And the reason for this is that if you're in the environment, okay, you're not reading, but you're looking at a cup, right? And it has a handle on it. If you rotate the cup 180 degrees and the handle's on the other side, still a cup,
Yeah.
still a cup. And so if you have evolved to identify cups in the environment, you might not be coding which direction the cup is facing. And so that's another reason you might have trouble. So again, you're having trouble seeing the difference in that case between a B and a D. So maybe you hear the difference, but to you, it's just a circle and a line. And kids who have this kind of problem often will say things like, the letters are jumping around on the page, or, they have a hard time figuring out what symbol goes with what sound. So that's another kind of dyslexia. You can have both kinds together. There's also an attentional piece. So a lot of people with dyslexia have a wide, they have ADHD, and they have this wide field of focus. So most people's focus, you have a wide field, and then you have a narrow part that you're focused in on in the middle of the field. But with dyslexia, they don't have that narrow part. They just have the wide part. So it's actually harder to see the individual letters. You can see the shape of the word, but you may not be able to see the words, even though the acuity is right. It's just that it's all a jumble. inside, if that makes
Interesting.
sense. So those are, different levels at which you can have trouble matching the sound to the symbol. Then you have sequencing, what order the letters occur in, and that can change the meaning of a word. If for you, one letter's here, another letter's here, another letter's here, you're going to have a hard time figuring out how those letters go together. So this is where our different, and this is actually one reason I do think we see things differently, is because some people really, really, really just, for them, it's like, okay, there's a T and there's a C and there's an A. And the most common combination of those letters is cat. So I'm going to just say cat, right?
Yeah.
They have to do all that work to figure it out.
Yeah.
So that's, that gets us back. We've kind of come full circle, right? That gets us back to this idea that people are perceiving the world in very different ways. And the way they can perceive them can have an impact on their ability to communicate with other people, but also to just navigate the world in the way that other people expect you to.
Yeah. Very interesting. I have so many more things that I could ask you, and I'm so bummed out that I don't have time. One of the things I wanted to talk a little bit about, but we don't have time to go into it, is the Big Five personality test, because it seems like there's some possibility to be misdiagnosed with things like ADHD because you might just be low in conscientiousness and high in neuroticism, but could be fidgety and stuff like that. And I wanted to dive into that and so much more.
Yeah. Well, I'd
but
love
yeah,
to come back. I really would love to come back. It's been a really interesting conversation. You've brought up some amazing points, and I love talking about this stuff, as you can tell.
yeah,
So,
definitely. And so do I. My podcast is very open-ended where I'll talk about just about anything.
mhm.
But psychology is one of the things I have so much interest in it because I'm just so interested in the human experience and how other people experience the world differently and how they,
Yes.
we come to these. I'm a very open person, like
Mhm.
very open. Like I don't cling to my positions too strongly. Like I have
Mhm.
things I very strongly believe, but for the most part, I just approach everything as I could be wrong. I could very well be wrong, and most likely I'm wrong about a lot of things that I think I'm right on. So that's
Live
just
and
how I
learn,
approach,
right?
yeah, all situations. So before we wrap up, do you want to give the listeners a way to find you if they want to work with you or if they want to read any of your information, your book, or learn
Yeah.
anything more?
So I'll give you my website, which is guidingexceptionalparents.com. That's my business website. And then the book website is isthisautism.com. And so I think those two places are a great place to get started, and just learn more about me. And there's different sides of me on each of those sites.
Awesome. Anything else you want to share or anything before we wrap up?
So here's my mantra. My mantra is, let difference inspire curiosity and not judgment.
I love that.
So
Dr. Wayland, thank you so much for talking to me today.
it's been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Thoughtfully Mindless. If you enjoyed it, I'd love to hear about it. You can find me on Instagram at Thoughtfully Mindless or on X at TM Convos. Until next time.